I just mentioned I've been on this job for 11 months. I have a little bit longer history in extension. I worked for about a year and a half before that between Fresno and Kern counties in a cotton breeding project for race-war fusarium resistance. So my research in manure and alfalfa is zip. It's all book learning for me at this point. And what I was hoping I could do for everyone is give an assessment of some local literature that we have that's relatively recent within the last 10 years, and try and come to a point where we all agree on what we know and don't know about manure applications in alfalfa. So I wanted to just understand the audience a little bit. Who's growing alfalfa? All right, so all but 3 people can fall asleep for the presentation. Okay. Do you apply manure to your alfalfa? No? Okay. That's pretty much the trend that had been the trend for a long time. There was some research 50, 60 years ago that I came across where they're looking at the impacts and the benefits of applying manure to alfalfa. But from what I can gather, the general consensus is that there's a lot of reasons stacked against applying manure to alfalfa. We'll go over some of those. And hopefully, I list some of those and you recognize it as your preoccupations with it. But over the last 10 years, with the Dairy General Order, we perceive that there may have been some more interest in applying manure to alfalfa, because as alfalfa has grown around dairies and taken up a lot of that acreage, now we might be seeing a limitation on the acreage where we can actually apply some of those nutrients and get them recycled. So I think that's why there might be a little bit of peak interest in applying manure to alfalfa. I want to start off first by, this is my soapbox. Very often in any literature about manure is conflated with the term waste. We talk about waste management, we talk about manure, but they're really 2 separate things. Manure is the animal excrement that we can apply to cropland or that we can compost, store, and waste is what we lose as a source of inefficiency in a system. We don't get it back. We can account for it, but it's not of any benefit to us. Okay. Now, I did a little bit of accounting on how much manure we produce in the San Joaquin Valley, and trying to put that into context with our alfalfa production, so that start thinking big numbers here. So in 2014, there were the 16 million tons of milk that were produced in the San Joaquin Valley. It equated to about 48 million tons of manure. We'll start talking about the nutrients that are a part of that manure a little bit later. And we've got just under 400 million acres of alfalfa that are grown in the San Joaquin Valley in 2014, producing almost 14 million tons of hay. So that, to me, seems like an opportunity where we can be, recycling some of these manure nutrients. One question that I have, and a lot of my colleagues who've been in the game much longer than I couldn't answer for me, is how much manure are we actually applying to alfalfa? That's really difficult data to get. I don't know how to get it yet, so if anybody has any suggestions, please push me along. I'm going to circle around this. I don't want to call it a red triangle, but this is in this Tri-County area. You do about half the production of milk and therefore manure. So this is a kind of a hot spot with manure management. So just to go over some basics. You probably already know this, so don't fall asleep yet. I saw some people getting coffee, and I appreciate that. One of the top benefits of manure is that it's a very rich source of your 3 macros: nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. But it also provides a suite of some micronutrients and some of your secondary macros. With repeated manure applications, you can build up your soil organic matter, and we've seen some benefits with greater water holding capacity, better aggregation of the soil, so better infiltration. And if we have some sodic soils, repeated applications of manure have also helped make the soils more permeable and leachable to try and reclaim the sodicity of that soil. And for some reason, I couldn't, the consensus in the literature was it happens, but we don't know why, and there's a whole list of reasons why it may be possible. Alfalfa has shown a better fertilizer response with the P and K with manure than with the mineral sources. I don't know why, but that's something I came across. So I told you I would give you a nutrient breakdown of what that almost 50 million tons of manure looks like. For us, in 2014, that was a production of 134,000 tons of nitrogen, 21 of phosphorus, and 52 of potassium. Keep that in mind because later on we'll start talking about actual fertilizer equivalence and what alfalfa takes up so that we can start thinking about using it as a nutrient source of all three of those macronutrients. The benefit of having alfalfa in manure croplands, so that's the flip from the last one, is that alfalfa has, we know, a very deep foraging root system. So when we're worried about leaching of nitrates below a crop root zone, alfalfa has been shown to be able to forage a lot of those nitrates from deeper in the profile. Some other crops that we know do that might be sorghum, for instance. It's also a relatively high consumer of nitrogen. So for every ton per acre of alfalfa production, you can take up about 60 pounds of nitrogen. That's pretty high. And we know that alfalfa, with the rhizobium bacteria relationship, will fix all of the nitrogen that it needs to grow. But that biological system has the flexibility to be able to switch from fixing atmospheric nitrogen to taking up nitrogen that resides in the soil from other sources. That includes manure. And there has not been, that I could come across, documentation of there being a yield drag because the plant was preferentially taking up soil nitrogen versus fixing nitrogen. We didn't see a lag from that. So they're almost perfectly interchangeable, it seems. I just mentioned all of that. Another thing to consider about alfalfa is that it can provide really good nitrogen credit for your following crop, and this is something to consider because if you already know this, but consider it now in the context of adding manure, right? So if you're adding a lot of that manure and the plant is taking it up preferentially, you can still be left over with that. You can still be left over with that credit. So it's not like we're going to be shooting ourselves in the foot by asking the plant to take it up from a soil source versus fixing it from the atmosphere. There's some my wife doesn't know anything about alfalfa, and she said, "Well, I should throw in an alfalfa joke." So precautions about alfalfa. I don't want you to. Oops. I don't want you to look like this guy. I don't want you to be really worried. But there are some things that we have to pay attention to. It's a long list, okay? And a lot of this applies to other crops when we're applying manure. So a really high rate of liquid manure, for instance, on a hot day can increase the risk of ammonia burn. So as you get some volatilization of the ammonium going into the plants, a lot of plants will be sensitive to that, especially in younger growth stages. On hot days also, with higher rates of manure application, we create a higher biological oxygen demand in the soil as those microbes are trying to eat up all of that carbon. They're going to be taking out a lot of oxygen from the soil, and can cause oxygen starvation in the plant. So that's associated with like scalding, I believe. Manure has a high salt index. So when you're applying manure, you always have to know what your total dissolved solids are or what the electrical conductivity of it is. That way you know what you're putting on the land and what your current crop and subsequent crop can actually handle. So be aware of that. Lagoon manure tends to, after repeated applications over a long period of time, soils will tend to see an accumulation of potassium. So in growing alfalfa hay, that can be a problem if the alfalfa starts to build up concentration above, I think it's like 3%. Hay might be rejected, or if it's not fixed in the mixed ration for the cow, cause a risk of milk fever. I've heard anecdotal evidence that in some areas with very, very high potassium in the soil, that it's acting like sodium in dispersing the clays. So, and it can do that, but I haven't seen it myself, but that's something to keep in mind. The flip side of that is with moderate K applications, potassium has a higher affinity for clay, so it can also add some benefit to leaching sodium. The other thing to consider is that there's a suite of heavy metals that can be associated with manure, and they might accumulate in your feed. And depending on the weed management on the farm and the source of the manure, manure can introduce more weed seeds back to the field. That can affect feed quality and affect the price of the hay. And we want to make sure that we're recycling nutrients and not weed seeds. Also, I don't know what people's practices are, but one of the big recommendations about applying solid manure to alfalfa is that it happens during the dormant period, and that could or pre-plant. And the consideration there is that you want it to be incorporated 6 to 8 inches down to reduce runoff, to make the nutrients more plant available. Or if it can't be incorporated, applied during dormancy, so that and before rain, so that we can use rain to try and knock those solid chunks off the plant crown, so that they don't obstruct or smother the plants or cause any kind of salt burn on them. The whole stack of challenges associated with applying manure to alfalfa. You don't need to read them, but I'll go through them. I want to say, like, if anybody has any comments, or I say something that just doesn't ring true, or you want to share your experience with, if something like this is maybe a big reason why you haven't applied manure to alfalfa, I want you to pipe up and perhaps share your experience, because I want to learn from it, and I want other people to be able to learn from it as well. So one of the, and I say challenges, and these are kind of challenging recommendations. We shouldn't be applying manure to alfalfa, and this may go for any crop, in rates that exceed the crop's ability to take up the nitrogen. So if, for instance, alfalfa can take up 60 pounds of nitrogen per ton per acre, that's what you should be applying for if you have a nitrogen fertility target with your a manure fertility program. An alternative to a nitrogen-based fertility program with manure would be to have a phosphorus-based fertility program with your manure, or a potassium-based fertility program with your manure. And I'll get into that toward the end, but that has a lot to do with trying to mitigate the potential accumulation of phosphorus if we're maybe in like a sensitive runoff area, or also the accumulation of potassium. So you want to try and if you can, make P and K the limiting factors and not nitrogen. Of course, then you have to come back in with alfalfa. You wouldn't need to come back in with any additional mineral nitrogen, but for other crops, of course, we recommend it become a mineral source of nitrogen to make up for that. Salinity management is going to be a challenge. That's obvious because of what I mentioned before. We could potentially be adding a huge load of salts to the field, but the recent drought is still fresh in a lot of our memories, and with future curtailments of surface water expected, I think that we have to really start crunching our minds down on the idea that we're going to be more often in situations where we don't have fresh water to have a leaching program to manage these salts. So that might mean being a little bit creative with some recycled sources of water and some gypsum applications or something like that. Timing of the application, I will go more into this later on a particular issue, but the timing of the application is particularly challenging. There's been some research. The results are pretty wide, but the major consensus is that during the establishment phase of alfalfa, it can benefit from getting a boost of nitrogen while the plants are still going through building up their symbiotic relationship with the rhizobium, and they're not fixing a lot of their nitrogen. We can see some early yield bumps and better stand health with early applications of nitrogen. You can do that with manure. To me, the biggest challenge in the timing of manure application is uncertainty in the mineralization rate of organic nitrogen. Or, in other words, not knowing exactly when the nitrogen, all of the nitrogen in your manure application is going to be available to the plant. It's a double whammy. This is a function of major multiple environmental factors determining when that nitrogen will become available from the organic fraction of your manure, but also depending on your manure source. So the constituents and the profiles of your manure, carbon, how much organic nitrogen you've got, all of that's going to change. And even with the same source, I've seen data from sample the lagoon every quarter, and I've seen the concentration change 4, 5, 10-fold between those samplings. So there's two major sources of variability to deal with there. In weed management, I'll talk about weed management when I get through distribution uniformity. So distribution uniformity, of course, is a major challenge. If you're spreading big clods, and you can see big clods look like soccer balls on the field, think about what that means to availability to the plants that don't have those clods. So if there are ways to spread a dry manure or mix the dry manure and break it up more, maybe a disc spreader would spread your manure a little bit more evenly, and then with of course incorporation would help. And then with liquid manure from the lagoon, the research is showing that there tends to be an accumulation of the bigger solids at the head of the field near the valve. They settle out first, and they can smother the plants. Okay, and then in liquid manure, most of the nitrogen is associated with the really fine particles, really fine solid particles in that lagoon water. So that means that if you're getting ponding at the end of the field, now you've got a bigger application of nitrogen toward the tail end of the field. So I wouldn't know how to deal with tailing that nitrogen at the end of the field. On the way over here, I did see a spreader off the 152 spraying, which you call a sprayer, spraying some liquid manure, doing that, a crosshatch pattern across the field. It's interesting. I don't know how common that is, but so now keeping in mind that with alfalfa, it's really common to get that ponding, and then you see that kind of bald spot at the tail. Now, if you're smothering at the front with the solids, now you've got to deal with that burn at the head of the field. or that low spot at the head of the field. So we all know that that's a good opportunity for weeds to come up. So now you're not just dealing with weeds at the head of, or at the tail of the field, but it's at the head of the field. You just doubled your weed problem. So weed management is important in the field. Make sure that you keep them out of the field. Keep your lagoons, the edges of your lagoons weed free. Try and get as weed free feed as possible as you can. Keep your irrigation ditches clean. Just keep them out of the field. And then if you do get weed problems, one thing that was suggested to me is when you do your round passes in harvest, I hope someone would nod yes or shake their heads no at me, but when you do your round passes to get your turnaround space, if you've got the weeds at the tail and the head end of the field, then when you go and bale it, that might be an opportunity to isolate those weed heavy bales from your better quality. Does that sound like it makes sense? Is that possible to do?
It's possible. Yeah.
Okay.
You can do it.
But
you can pick up your in pass.
Okay. There's something to consider. Now, on timing, am I okay on time? Speaking of which.
Maybe like, Dan, whatever you've got about 45 minutes.
I can wrap it up pretty quick.
Okay.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
On timing, manure applications to plant availability. This comes out of the manure guideline technical series that Stu Pettigrove and a lot of other specialists, Dan Putnam, for instance, and Jen Miller, spent a lot of time putting together. In this table, you see that you've got your different manure sources. There your lagoon water, sludge and slurry, or growl scrapings, and then screen solids. And then in your first year, it's saying you can expect 40 to 50% of your organic nitrogen to mineralize. Well, that's great for the first year. For one application, that's real easy to factor into your nitrogen budget. But what if you've got repeat applications? There's a note. It says 40 to 70% of mineralization within that year or within that application will occur sometime between 4 and 8 weeks. So we've got 3 windows of time that we're trying to make work for us here. I don't know how much benefit that information is in such a rapid harvest cycle, but in terms of being able to build up your nitrogen, I think it's good news in that we know that from some of these sources, a lot of it's going to be readily available early on. So if it's not available for this cutting, it's going to be available for your next cutting to take up. You have to know your manure. I think you're familiar with when and how you're supposed to sample for nitrogen in your lagoon and your dry manure, so I won't go over it. But I wanted to point out our manure management specialist, Deanne Meyer, quoting on San Joaquin Valley Beach, says, the first critical control point for obtaining useful data is collecting a representative sample. So we can sample all we want, but if you're not getting a representative sample, you don't really know what's going on in the field until you start doing those post-mortems. You've got your tissue tests from harvest, your end of season soil nitrogen analyses. But improving on representative sampling is going to help make more prescriptive applications of nitrogen to your crop. And can I make this presentation available to everyone afterwards?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we can put it on our website. Yeah.
Good. I've got some resources, some links. Deanne Meyer with the California Dairy Quality Assurance Program put together a series of courses. One of them is a decision tree telling you, as you answer the questions, yes or no, whether or not your protocol for sampling your manure is likely to give you a representation of what's going on. So that might be helpful. I already talked about all of those. Really quick, I wanted to talk about just the actual fertilizer equivalence of some of these to try and put it into a perspective about why potassium and phosphorus might be accumulating. These come from 3 different sources. They're all pretty close. The N, P, and K removal of alfalfa in fertilizer equivalence is about 4.5 nitrogen to 1 phosphorus to 4 potassium. A lot of the manure is applied in our flushing system is applied as lagoon water. So you can tell, right, because of this ratio, that if you were trying to meet your nitrogen fertility with manure, that you would automatically be over-applying phosphorus and potassium, because if you multiply your nitrogen up, you also have to multiply up your phosphorus and potassium. And that's why I talk about considering a phosphorus and potassium-based fertility plan. These are some actual tested removal rates. This looks like it was a potassium or phosphorus-based. Actually, it looks like it was a phosphorus-based fertility plan. This is done by Steve Pettigrove, Dan, and Shannon, and one of their colleagues back in 2010. So, for instance, with 100 pounds of phosphorus applied as manure over the year, the harvest removal was 100 pounds, and then you've got about a 300-pound difference in removal of nitrogen, meaning with the 200 pounds of nitrogen that were applied in manure, as expected, alfalfa plant was able to fix the rest of its nitrogen and pull up an expected 500 pounds. Probably an 8-ton yield, 8.5-ton yield on that. We talk about that, we get that, and then, like I mentioned, I'm going to have a list of resources for you. These are all pretty accessible. They're not academic journals or anything, but they're all resources that we have on our UC websites and have been written for audience like consultants and growers, hoping that basically there's something that it gets read and that it's up to date. So I will make one caveat. If you're interested in that learning tool that Deanne Meyer and CDQAP put together, and taking advantage of, or just going through that decision tree type module, you will have to contact Trisha Price, who was the Deanne's tech, who put that together to get access for it. I think because it's kind of in an early stage of development, and they don't necessarily want just anybody going in and using it. Just say, hey, I'm a producer, or hey, I'm a consultant, I want to be able to use it. They give you access to it, and you have access for life, and I believe it's free, and you can take the courses as they pop up. So that's it. I don't have a pretty picture slide at the end, but are there any questions? Good, thanks.